siloed approach to anything. They expect organizations to be flatter. They don't respect bureaucracy and hierarchy. Just because you have a title doesn't mean you earn their respect. And they also have been taught by teachers to be risk takers in their learning. And they've also been told repeatedly that they can do anything they want to do and that they have the right to be heard. And so these are really important things to think about, because if you sit that alongside the fact that they're not respectful of institutions for the sake of the institution. And then the other really interesting piece, in my view, is the emergence of video games. This generation has very little fear of failure. And when you think about it in terms of video games, what they've learned is to learn from failure. You know, if you're in the video game and you're riding along in your monster and you get to the point and you die, you think, wow, if I get to that point, I shouldn't turn right, I'll die, I'll turn left. And they learn, and then they turn left, and they go to the next level, and they do the same thing, and they start over. And that energy of learning from each other and learning from failure is something that gives them a really great resilience. And so when you take all these things together, you end up with this uniquely different generation of young people. And they really believe in doing good well. They think that their values and their purpose should be an integral part of everything they do. There is no work-life balance from the perspective of, you know, I have this many hours at home and then I have this line in the sand and then I go to work. That's binary, and they don't think that way. They think that their purpose and their values should be part of their job. They should enjoy their job. They should have opportunity to be heard in their role. They should have opportunity to do the things that they're passionate about and be supported by their companies. When they prioritize the things that would be in an incentive package, the money isn't at the top. And within organizations, you know, we need to think about, how do you incentivize? I mean, my husband just recently had a conversation with the HR people in his office, and they were saying that it's estimated now in London that 45% or more of the businesses are going to institute a flexible work policy. And what that means is, if you're in HR, you now have to consider it as part of a pay package, because it is competitive. And this generation likes flexibility. They like to say, I'm going to do this work, but I'm going to be project driven. I'm not going to work from 9 to 5 because it says work 9 to 5. I'm going to have these things to get done today, and I'm going to get them done today. And if it's done at 3 o'clock, then I'm going outside. And so it's just a different way of engaging with a professional money earning side of their life and the values driven side. They really respect collaboration because of that background in schooling, and they learn from each other in a way that hasn't happened before. I mean, there was a study done a few years ago by Scorpio Foundation, and they found that they had the first generation that actually believed they had had an experience based on what they learned from someone else. So that's part of why this social media movement is so powerful with them, because when they are influenced by the influencers, they really believe it, they experience it. And so organizations, employers, impact investments, funds, people need to think about how they engage with this generation of people, because, they have about a 7-second attention span, which I'm not exaggerating. And they learn by video, they learn by picture, they learn by infographic. They want their information in executive summary form. So if you are going to share your thinking and your thought leadership with them, short, sweet, and to the point. And so when you think about that within the context of a family office and coming up with, a values aligned approach to their wealth, you have to think that there's a guilt that is right underneath the surface with this generation, thinking about the fact that they have access to all this wealth and that globally there's such a disparity of wealth. And so instead of this generation approaching this pending transfer of historic wealth, they feel a tremendous responsibility with it. And they are approaching it with a great amount of purpose and transparency. And this is something that's happening in family offices. There's a lot of pressure on trustees. There's a lot of pressure on the actual staff of family office that what they do needs to be transparent, that their approach to taxes is transparent and responsible and looks at tax efficiency, not tax avoidance. And all of these things are creating tension between the current wealth holding generation and this younger generation. And my experience is that the way to build consensus and bridges across these generations is really to peel everything back to the values. And so what we like to do is start with, what does it mean to be a Blackwell? What does it mean to be in this family? What do we stand for? And if it's a family business, why did we build it? What were we doing? What was success looking like? And, talk about the things that went wrong in the family up to this point. So, if we started the business to make product A and it was a flop and product B is the one that made us our wealth, well then great, but let's really focus on product A. Like, what did we learn and how did you learn? And keep that entrepreneurial spirit going, because what happens is you make a lot of money and then the next generation panics and is not about wealth creation, they're about wealth preservation. And so then the risk appetite crashes and all they want to do is not be the generation that loses the money. So then the next generation comes along and there might be a little spirit of entrepreneurialism in there. And funny enough, that was part of what made the money in the first place. But yet you're not encouraged to follow that because A, there's reputational risk to making a mistake. And B, we're not going to lose it. We don't want to be the generation that loses it. So you end up with all this tension where people say, well, I'm tied to this family wealth, but yet I can't do what I want. This is my opportunity. And this is where impact investment comes in. This is where venture philanthropy comes in. It is the most wonderful entry point for millennial wealth holders or soon to be wealth holders to feel as if they can contribute because they're not afraid of all of the things that can potentially go wrong with an impact investment or venture philanthropy or being a disruptor or being innovative. And so if we start by talking about what the family cares about and we can get a core set of values that everybody can agree on, then what we can say is, okay, if you approach wealth, most of us think of a risk mitigated, diverse asset allocation, right? Well, if you think of that in terms of your impact assets, then it becomes very interesting because you end up with a soft landing spot for each person along the risk continuum in the family. So if you have the current wealth holders saying, I want my money to make money and my philanthropy is over here and the two are not connected, then what that middle generation does is fill in the gap on that continuum. So you can say, okay, fine, you've got investments over here. And then you think, okay, well, let's engage with ESG because at this point, there is enough evidence to show that you're not going to get a reduced return because you engaged with ESG frameworks. So we can calm down the generation that is more conservative and less risk hungry and a little confused about the language of impact investing. And we can have a portfolio that's nicely diversified with ESG frameworks. And then we can think about, okay, let's talk about impact investment. And, if the main thing that I try to explain to families is that, ESG is a framework that looks at a business's operating model. How are these components embedded into the business? And as you shift to impact investing, it is about intentionality of goods and services. So the company, in theory, should, and in most instances does, have ESG frameworks that are controlling how the operation of the company is. However, the goods and services delivered by the company are achieving impact alongside a return. And so now you start getting the next generation really excited because they can have the slightly more innovative, disruptive, slightly riskier approach, but you can still mitigate risk with an impact. I had this amazing presentation with a company called B Finance last week. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they are similar to a Cambridge or Mercer. They do investment manager selection searches. And they're a brilliant disruptor in the sector. And they were doing a search about impact investment firms. And, you know, they happen to be looking at UK housing. And you have everything from government-backed fixed income all the way through to, you know, investment managers that are doing equity and everything in between. So within your little pot that is impact investing, you can still mitigate risk and have a diversification of your timeline, of your potential return, and of the potential impact. So if you're talking to the older generation, now you can say, okay, you've got your pot and you're comfortable with it. Within this scary impact investment pot, here's some really low risk, you know, mitigated things that are still achieving impact. And then we've got the stuff that has the potential to be catalytic capital, the things that could really change the world. And then you look at where's the role of venture philanthropy. And to me, venture philanthropy is really exciting because if we have this huge shortfall in attacking the SDGs by 2030, then someone needs to assume the risk. So if you have venture philanthropists who are willing to come in and go into a multi-asset class situation, take some of the risk off the top, you can get some of these pension investors, places that need more of a daily liquidity, and you can get more people involved, more institutionally sized assets involved in the delivery of impact. And I think that that's a really exciting thing for families when they think, well, you know, philanthropy feels a bit stale, philanthropy feels, you know, a little bit like what my grandparents did, and it can kind of bring it to life in a different way. And another interesting way of getting the older generation excited and the younger generation excited is recently I worked with a family that integrated a grant to a US research institution for 2 graduate students to work within the mechanical engineering department to build prototypes to address some sort of climate issue. At the end of their project, they were presented. This university happens to be known for getting early stage funding for its students' projects. And because it made the decision not to own intellectual property rights of their students, this opportunity for the family meant that once this prototype's made, if the family is interested in it, they can be an early stage impact investor. And they can put venture capital forward for this idea to get off the ground. And that's a really interesting way to say to a family, okay, here's your traditional philanthropic grant, but then here's this wonderful opportunity that comes later so that you can stay engaged with that money over time. And those are the kinds of things that build conversation across the family and bring people together to see that they can honor the legacy of the family, they can honor the values that they care about, but they can do it in a way where there's something for everyone. And that is really rewarding because it's a slow transition, but then the respect starts to be built for the next generation because they show commitment and research and responsibility, and it takes a bit of that nervous feeling away from the current wealth holders. So I guess I don't want to talk the whole time. So if anybody has any questions or wants to think, dig more deeply into a specific area, I'd be very happy to take questions. Otherwise, I can keep talking. So Christina, you tell me.
Well, I love to hear you talk. So I'm all for you talking, but I do think that there might be some questions from anybody in the audience. Please don't feel shy. Otherwise, I have questions. Or I can put somebody on the spot. I know who I'm going to put on the spot. He always has questions. Nobody?
I have a question, Amy. It's Edith.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll put my. What I currently see is and you touched upon the topic before. I think what you say is very interesting, but I do see a huge gap within current corporate management and the engagement of younger people. And I don't see that this bridge is being closed at this point in time, at least definitely not if I would say in Switzerland. So how is that in the US, and how do you see that going forward, and how do you see what is needed to build that bridge? Because it's a huge difference in mindset.
Well, I think if you think about publicly traded companies, I think that what is going to happen is their shareholders will make demands, and that will bring about change. So I really do believe that this move toward very active shareholder engagement across institutional investors is one thing that will continue to push the envelope. I think the fact that they're making some direct connections between diversity, equity, and inclusion having strong financial impact on company profits. I mean, I read recently that just gender diversification within companies had something like a 25% increase in companies' profitability. And if you included gender and ethnic, it went up to something like 38%. And so I think that the numbers will push the dial, because companies will be more sustainable and more likely to be profitable the more they adopt these approaches. I think that they will struggle to recruit high quality entry-level, mid-level, and low executive level people if they can't demonstrate authentic integration of ESG metrics in the way they're operating. I do think that some of it will take time, but I think that boards of directors, have certain responsibilities and reputational risk. And I think that people tend to protect themselves as instinct. And so I think that there will be more and more pressure. I think that it's a slightly different thing within privately held businesses, like private equity firms, venture capital firms, family businesses. They don't have the same level of transparency that you have in a publicly traded firm. But I think, again, if you use an example of private equity, I know there are a lot of conversations happening at the moment about the introduction of ESG metrics, because what's happening is a lot of times when companies are looking to invest in other companies, they set all of these very stringent ESG frameworks and metrics that these people have to achieve in order to be invested in, whether it's a venture capital startup or whether it's private equity or whether it's an investment manager looking for their own portfolio that they manage. And oftentimes when I'm meeting with those investment managers or private equity, I'll say, if you take your ESG policy and flip it and look in the mirror, would you invest in yourself? And oftentimes the answer is dead silence, because they couldn't possibly invest in themselves based on the metrics they're requiring investees to have. So I think the more they're put on the spot and the more that educated investors are saying, it's not a box ticking exercise. I want to see an authentic integration. And, we were recently on the phone with an investment manager potentially placing £50 million portfolio. And we were interviewing 19 different managers. And we had this one manager and we were talking about ESG, and he said to us, now my partners and I, all women, and all of us were in banking in the 80s and 90s, right? And he says, we're really excited. We have our first female investment manager coming next week. And we said, how is it possible you can be excited about that? You should be so ashamed that this is the best you could come up with. He's like, they're really hard to get. We said, maybe in 1980, they were hard to get.
Yeah.
They are not hard to get now. And so I think the more that people are named and shamed, and the more that they lose out on 50 million in a pot on a single go because they can't answer that question, the more they say, you know, we need to make a change. But I think it is a lot slower than it should be. But in the end, money will drive the change.
Thank you so
And
much.
as long as you are not, yeah, I mean, I think if you're not losing returns and people are looking at it and saying, I can have these ESG frameworks, I can see, you know, all of these positive changes within an operational side of a company and still make my money, it's very hard to argue that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And remember, like, I don't know what it is in other countries, but in the UK, 60% of wealth will be in the hands of women by 2025.
Yeah.
Women invest differently. You know, we don't. We invest with trust and values, and we're driven by a depth of commitment to these things. And so I think that that pressure is only going to grow.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amy. And I already see that the people in the chat say these were awesome remarks. So I'll leave it back to you, but I'm really, really grateful for your answer. Thank you.
I know that John has a question, and since he's the only male on the call, I think, nope, we also have Paul. I'm going to hand the floor over to you, John, and then I have a question from Megan that I'm going to read afterwards.
Well, as a male from an investment management firm that answered questions like Amy just described, right? I'm conscious of my place, but I'm not gonna do social justice right now. I will say I agree with all of your words, but I wanted to ask a bit more abstruse question about when you're talking about venture philanthropists coming in to help take the slice, to take a little bit of that risk slice off the top. It sounds euphonic to me, right? I can hear the bells, I can hear the harp playing, but can you tell us more about how that works, right? You know, if I'm the person who wants to be the slice right below the venture philanthropist, right? You know, how does that deal get structured so that they can take a little bit of the heat?
Yeah. Well, the first time it was explained to me actually was a few years ago by Tom Hall, who was, you know, does head of philanthropy at UBS in their Optimus fund. And, you know, he was describing it. I was at an impact investment conference, and he was describing it like a layer cake. And he just said, you know, you've got venture philanthropy coming in saying, you know, we are willing to make a return that would be higher, you know, that would come back into the foundation, which foundations are perfectly capable of making profit in impact. I mean, trustees are allowed to do that and encouraged to do that. But the idea being that if there is risk and if somebody is going to lose their shirt, then the venture philanthropy becomes a grant. And that grant money helps to pay off some of the people who are at the lower rate of return, lower down in the cake. And so, and I know that if you look at there's some really great, I'm blanking on the word, infographics actually on the website from Optimus that he had brought up that break down the share levels. So I would take a look at that. The other thing I think is a really interesting approach, which I'm a really big fan of, is results-based financing. And I think that there's a real role. I mean, traditionally, there have been a lot of roles where governments would say, we'll bring in independent private people to do a certain thing we've agreed on. They're going to deliver, you know, electricity to a very hard to reach population. And, you know, we've got these pre-approved metrics. They have to deliver to this many households. It has to be reliable for 6 months. And you know, and it has to be priced in a way that's value added. And if you've achieved these things, then the government will step in and will pay that independent provider with, you know, a set return for having fronted it, right? And then sometimes there's even lenders who are in the middle of that circle who front the money for the loan for the provider to come in and do it. But what's happening is that's beginning to shift to private investors rather than just governments. And, you know, so they're looking at it and saying, okay, well, you know, on a big infrastructure project, I could put that money up, and this company that knows the area and can function and has more likely to deliver success than a motley crew that we could put together. Let them do that, let them deliver. But what's interesting is it's not enough just to deliver it. So when they talk about results-based financing, what I love about it is that you've got to meet these metrics. And usually the metrics relate to, you know, you did it, it's been delivered, you know, you've had the outcomes that you said you would. So if you've built a bridge, you can now get traffic over it of this volume. You know, it is open communication between these two places. Here's the economic impact of that. But what's great is there's a time period where it has to be effective and it has to be reliable. And, you know, the bridge didn't fall down and the electric didn't burn their house down, and, you know, or the water was actually clean, and whatever it is that was delivered. And so I think there are more and more creative ways for people to approach some of these really big, expensive, long-term things collaboratively with partners. And, you know, when I think about the SDGs, I think about, you know, number 17 to me is the one that will be the most powerful one in the end. Because it really doesn't care. I don't really care what you care about. You know, you could care about the water, the education, the children, whatever. But these problems are big and they're entrenched and they cost trillions and trillions and trillions to fix. And the only thing that's going to get us from 1 to 30, or, you know, and through the 17 SDGs is collaboration with other partners. And so that speaks to what millennials stand for. And that's why I find it very optimistic when you think about the next, you know, 9 years toward 2030 and what could be accomplished with the shortfall that we see. And I think that this collaborative approach of how do we magnify our impact? How do we bring in people who have the best skills for that particular thing and get our ego out of it and say, okay, let's put all these smart people at the table and make a plan. And so I think because power is going to shift to this generation and this is in their DNA, it's a really optimistic place to be, because I really believe that they will be motivated to make the changes. And you know, talking about the question about, you know, slow business results, you know, Edith's question about how businesses are responding, you know, I think that this willingness of this generation to name and shame and to be a values-driven consumer, it applies to their banking, it applies to their investments, it applies to their tennis shoes, it applies to everything. And so, you know, the reputational risk of companies not to engage in impact and ESG will be bigger than potentially their desire for the status quo.
Thank you so much. I love that. And I mean, Megan, I am going to read your question. I'm just going to abuse the fact that I'm the moderator and just grab hold of the mic. And I really love the fact that you see this in that generation, and also the fact you mentioned, you know, that they're used to working in teams. Because one of the things that I observe is that now we're all talking about ESG, many are speaking about sustainability, but you have a lot of people who have absolutely no experience in it. And for me, that's a huge danger. It is as dangerous as if I start giving people advice on return on investment. That would be pretty horrible. And I think I love this outlook that they will gather teams with specific experiences and specific expertise to actually work together. I think that's really, really important. Just going to read Megan's question. First of all, she says, thank you for the insight so far. And then I wondered if you are seeing any trends in terms of the values Nextgen are coming up with in terms of their philanthropy, impact investments, and so on. And I know that you do, so.
Well, I think one thing when you think about philanthropy in areas for focus, I think that everything related to climate change is a priority for this generation because they believe that they have been left with this problem and it's theirs to solve. And there's an intensity to that commitment. So I think that, the idea of renewable energy, the idea of, new approaches to fast fashion, new approaches to recycling, interesting strategies for transportation. There's a sense that they, instead of being drawn to, the quick and easy solution, for a generation that has a 7-second attention span, they have a very, I would say, measured approach to this. They understand that it took a long time to do the damage that's been done, and that in order to unravel all that complexity, it's going to take commitment and it's going to take time. And I talk about impact assets. So, and what I mean by that is someone's wealth, someone's networking connections, and someone's skills. And over their lifetime, it ebbs and flows because, if you're young and you're out of school and you've just started a job, you don't have a lot of money to give away. You have lots of skills because you're fresh out of school, and you have a network and connections of other people your age who want to amplify their impact. So collectively, there's this desire to be part of movements and to, you can see it when everything is a hashtag something, and they want to feel as if they're part of something that's bigger than they are, because the problems that we're facing are bigger than all of us. And so unless you want to feel like you're at the base of Kilimanjaro in flip-flops, you have to feel like you're connected with other people on a journey. So I think that the trends I see for millennials is that they want to see fellow people on the journey. They want to join others. They want the people that they know, because this comes out of that school thing I talked about where they learn in teams. You knew what your best skill was, and then you paired up with other people in a team, and everybody identified where they added the most value. And that's how the team worked. And that's what they want to see with their advisors. They want me to swim in my lane. They do not want me to offer a legal structure because it would be a disaster. They don't want Christina to offer advice on their investments. They want you to accept that there's a limit to your knowledge and not try to be everything to everybody, and not be threatened by the fact that there are other smart people in the room. So they would rather that we all celebrate the fact that we could bring a bunch of smart people together and solve a problem, rather than have this attitude of don't talk to my client. And that's really tricky within the wealth management space, in my view, because everything has been about, my assets under management. And so people don't share very nicely. And it's going to be a paradigm shift as this money transfers to other generations, because women especially don't appreciate that approach. They want you to say, okay, I'm at the edge of what I know, and here's some other really smart people who are going to come in and talk to you about what you need that I don't know. So I think that's a big piece of it. I think that the organizations and the sectors that are going to struggle are the arts, sadly. I think that there's a sense that Nextgen is saying, the arts are really nice, but, we need to stop poisoning our water. Or, the problems are bigger than the opera. And so I think it will be a real struggle for those institutions as the holders of the wealth shift and that commitment to arts changes. So I do see that as a challenge, because everything feels very urgent right now. And so people are trying to tackle what they see as the biggest threat.
I have to say that usually I find the millennials to be slightly annoying and irritating, but in this conversation, they are really growing on me. We're presenting them very well. I love this fact that they actually respect competence and that they really, that's what they want, that each of us, as you say, stay in our line. I have a question, actually I have two questions, one from Natasha. We are used to define value as only financial. Going from ego to ecosystem is a huge transformation globally. Do you see the necessity to transform the definition of the value and performance along with this?
Do you mean value and performance of investments? Or do you mean value and performance of people in business?
I mean investments. Hi.
Yeah, well, I think, if you think about an impact investment and the definition from Gin of an impact investment, you have intentionality of impact alongside profit, and they run parallel, and they're of equal importance. I mean, that's, in theory, that's the definition. And if you don't have one or the other, it's not an impact investment. So I think that impact investments, if you are properly measuring impact with metrics that you've set out ahead of time and can honestly engage with, I think that you can understand the value of an investment more easily than you can in some other sectors. I think that there is a very strong movement to universalizing and regulating ESG metrics. I think that the move toward a more common language about measuring impact and measuring ESG to give true scores, because right now, every single investment management firm has a framework and a scoring method, and there's no apples to apples, right? Because they're all, and it's very proprietary. No, we can't tell you how it is, but we scored them and they did really well. But pay no attention to what's happening behind the curtain. So unfortunately, until we get to a point where we're speaking a common language, that's always going to be tricky. I think that the more we see the evidence of profitability and sustainability and retention of employees and attractiveness to recent graduates as metrics of value, when we start to see that, I think it will be much easier to say about a company, this is a valuable investment. Not only will you have a profit, but you can see the benefit of a truly authentic integrated approach to ESG. And at this point, I think that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. And I think that there's a tremendous effort to legitimize the ratings so that people believe in them. And so I think that that will come, and we're certainly moving in the right direction, but it's definitely going to take more time. And I think that the exclusionary approach of investments is really tricky. If you give the example of oil, right? The problems that we have with renewable energy isn't finding renewable energy opportunities. It's how do you scale them? How do you scale them? So if you're in the UK and you are looking at wind power, solar power, whatever, that's fine, but how do you scale that? And so I think that, some of the oil companies that are looking at unbelievably creative things, because they have huge R&D budgets. I mean, they don't want to cease to exist, right? So they have every incentive in the world to be part of the solution. So, cutting them off as an exclusionary investment approach is a really tricky thing, because they're the ones who stand to have the infrastructure and the budgets to scale the really great ideas. Because you can have a tiny little company that has a really great idea, but they're never going to have the ability to scale it. So you have to think about, who can be the innovation, who can be the disruptor, and then who plays a part in scaling it up. And those may not all be the same people, but there is a value for really big multinational companies coming in and authentically having the skills to scale it up. We're not there yet, but I think that, you know, we cut our nose off to spite our face if we divest of every company that has the potential to deliver what we discover. So, which is purely my opinion. And I know there are a lot of people who, you know, believe that exclusionary sends a message, but my view is you're better off to be an active investor and influence the thinkers on the board and in the executive room than you are to walk away, because you lose your vote when you walk away.
I mean, I think everybody who's ever heard me say anything know that I think that unless you engage, you can't. I mean, as you say, you cut off your nose to spit your face, because also when you talk about oil, yes, it's fine to divest if that's what you absolutely want to do. But first of all, we're not going to transform into an energy and from one day to another where we don't need oil. And then you also need to stop investing anybody and everything that might use a piece of plastic, because that's how plastic is actually produced, right? It's from petrol and it uses that. So you need to engage. I'm saying that, and then I'm going to read a message or a question from Sarah saying, how aware do you think Nextgen are about the importance of biodiversity and natural capital? Do you see any interest to invest in these areas?
One of the things that's really interesting about biodiversity is if you think of, you know, landed estates, so families that are cash poor and asset wealthy, right? So they've got big pieces of property, big houses, they're very illiquid, they've got lots of generations of mouths to feed, and, you know, they're thinking of how in the world am I going to create an income stream? There's a real move toward diversification, and one of those things is related to biodiversity, because there are a lot of regulations now that require offsets. So if there is a development or redevelopment of an area, it may require some sort of biodiversity offset. And so what some of these large landed estates that have thousands of acres, what they're doing is they're basically taking long-term leases with these development firms and saying, fine, we'll let that go to meadow and we'll allow that biodiversity to happen. And so just as you can offset carbon, there's some really interesting things being done in biodiversity space. There's also a really interesting company called Arvella, A-R-V-E-L-L-A. And the gentleman started at Bruno. They have two approaches there. It's really interesting. They have a temperature controlled portfolio, which measures whether or not your portfolio, based on the stocks that you own, is Paris aligned. So it's like 2 degrees or less in your portfolio. And that's an incredible, the metrics of how they're figuring out is really wonderful. But they're also looking at doing the same thing with a biodiversity scale, and how biodiverse is your portfolio, and looking at companies' negative and positive impact. And you know, if you look at Harvard's doing that new negative screening for companies, where you would get a negative score for your negative impact against, so that you get kind of a mitigated score. So I think that there's quite a bit of effort being put toward looking at ways to analyze the real actual footprint of a company. And that's where I think Nextgen is very engaged in that kind of honest reporting of, you know, what are you leaving behind as an organization? What is your footprint, you know? And it's tricky depending on the industry. It is tricky, and some organizations will have no choice but to, you know, buy offsets because of the nature of what they do. But I think that there are some real opportunities especially in that area of repurposing large swaths of land as offsets. And that is becoming quite popular. They're also, you know, looking at ways of opening more of the countryside so that you've got more habitats for animals, because one of the things that I know came up quite a bit during lockdown was the amazing way that animals came back to places. Like if you looked in the national parks in the US and you looked at, all of a sudden you had animals that for 25 years, forestry people hadn't seen. And so it was this little glimmer of hope of, you know, look what happens when people naturally step out of this invasion of space. And so what it's giving people is a moment to think about behavior and choices. And, you know, we'll see what happens when we come out of the pandemic, when it comes back to traveling and it comes back to, you know, will people jaunt off the same way that they did with short haul plane flights, or will they get on a train? Will they, you know, we'll see. I don't think we know yet.
Thank you so much. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I was thinking perhaps if you want to give your final thoughts and words of wisdom, or if there's one final question.
Well, I guess if there's no questions, I would say the few takeaways are, one, that within families of all generations, communication is the trickiest piece and the most important piece. And starting conversations that are values driven, legacy driven, and purpose driven take away some of the tensions that exist across generations. And so I would always start there. The second thing is that patience is really important, and patience is really hard for young people, right? As you get older, you just have a different approach to patience, and things happen, and you know you're less maybe less in a hurry. And so, you know, impact investments take time, right? You don't build an infrastructure project, measure the impact in any authentic way in 12 minutes. So, you know, it's a slow process. The introduction of a really risk mitigated approach across all the assets of a family, that takes time. It takes a lot of conversation. It takes a commitment to a journey. And you're really lucky as a trusted advisor if you get to be part of that journey. So don't abuse it. Be grateful, know the edge of your knowledge and bring in the right people, and be brave about holding a mirror up to people and saying, you're saying this, but in your family business, that's not what you do. Because, you know, they need to hear it. And if they trust you, they will hear you. That doesn't mean they'll listen to you, but they'll hear you. All you can hope for is that. But I think that if you build a common agenda across the generations that they buy into, and it creates purpose, then the rest of it slowly falls into place. As long as everyone feels that they had a voice, that everyone has skin in the game, and that it is worth being part of this family community, then the commitment sticks around. And I do think that if you're going to have a sustainable impact of any kind, you always have to remember that it's not sustainable if you can't leave. So if you don't empower the people you're helping to be able to help themselves, then you can't ever leave. So you can have amazing impact, but the minute you set foot out of that environment, it's gone. So you really need to think about putting yourself out of a job when you do impact, because if you don't, you really haven't achieved much.
I think those were very powerful last words. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor having you here with us, Amy. On behalf of Women in Sustainable Finance, I really want to thank you so much, and thank all of you who participated. You can find Amy on LinkedIn. You can also reach out to us and we will put you in touch in case you have follow-up questions or anything. Thank you so very, very much, Amy.
Well, I appreciate all the patience and listening. And, you know, these millennials have a lot of really good ideas. Don't dismiss them just because they're millennials, because I really truly believe that they will be incredibly responsible with their wealth and very purposeful, and they will leave it better than they found it.
Those are very nice and heartwarming words. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I think that what you have achieved this
Thank
evening
you.
is that
And get in touch.
yes. Everybody is excited by your
I'm
words
happy to
and
talk to-
inspired by your words. So huge thankful on behalf of Women in Sustainable Finance.
Oh, you're welcome. Now everyone can go get wine.
Exactly.
Thank you so much.
That's right.
So much. I wish you
Bye.
all a nice evening.
Have a
Amy.
good evening.
Have a lovely
Thanks,
evening, all of
Christina,
you.
for organizing and hosting.
No, thank you
Bye.
thank you, Edith. Thank you so much. Amy will be in touch really soon.
Okay,
Bye.
sounds good. Take care.
You too.
Perfect.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I'll switch off for everyone now. Thank you. Bye-bye.